and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Transforming the System, Criminal Justice Policy Solutions and Public Opinion. I'm Bridget Whalen, Training and Engagement Coordinator here at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds toward lasting policy and culture change. This year we're celebrating our 10th anniversary with a series of webinars that highlight our work. Today, we're very glad to be offering a walkthrough presentation of our recent report and website, Transforming the System, which outlines a range of solutions for outdated and unjust criminal justice policies, an overview of public opinion on justice issues, and ideas for how to talk about them to your audiences. We're joined today by the members of our team who made this report happen, and I want to thank them so much for their work and their time with us today. Our speakers are India Tusi, she's the Associate Counsel, and Robert L. the Opportunity Agenda, Lauren Siegel, a consultant for the Opportunity Agenda, and lastly, our Senior Framing and Messaging Coordinator, Julie Fisher-Rao. We're going to be taking questions after each speaker, so please feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. You can also tweet questions to me at Bridget M. Whalen on Twitter, and we'll attempt to answer as many of your questions as we can. Also, please feel free to join the conversation online. We're using hashtag TransformCJ for today's discussion. You can also tweet at OpAgenda. And you can also access the report online by visiting transformingthesystem.org. After our webinar concludes today, a short evaluation is going to pop up on your screen. Please do take time to fill that out so that we can improve our future webinars based on your feedback. You're also going to be receiving a follow-up email with a few different materials from today's presentation, including a recording of this webinar, so you should feel free to share that with anyone in your network. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. A big thank you again for joining us today, and a special thank you to each of our speakers. First up is India Tusi.
Hi, this is India, and I'm the Associate Counsel at the Opportunity Agenda. And today I'm going to speak a little bit about the Criminal Justice Policy Solutions report that we've just recently released. And I want to start by first talking about the moment that we're in, and then I'll highlight some of the communications resources in the report, as well as highlight the importance of connecting policy solutions with public opinion, and then actually walk through the website. And in thinking about the moment that we're in, it's a very critical moment for us as a country. We have the bipartisan support for criminal justice reform, but we also have a movement for social change. We have the movement for Black Lives Matter, and we also have a moment of transition as a nation. So it's important for us as advocates interested in criminal justice reform to really make sure that we're telling a shared narrative around criminal justice. And so the way that we're thinking about this website is it's an actual communication tool for how you speak about this issue and ensure that we're embracing a holistic and intersectional shared narrative around criminal justice reform. So we have several resources available to you on the website, including the policy solution itself. There's also VPSA flashcards. For those of you already familiar with our approach, you'll know that we use a method called VPSA, which stands for Value, Problem, Solution, and Action. And what it is an actual formula for drafting communications and for developing your communications and messaging strategy. We also have a one-page document that highlights the different ways to approach the criminal justice system and different values that are at stake. So right now I'm going to jump right in by actually doing a full walkthrough through the website. That way you have a sense of how you can use this resource and how it can help you in your advocacy work. So when you first enter the website, you'll notice that there's this artistic piece at the top of the website, and this was actually created for us and commissioned by Alexa Garcia, who's an artist who works as one half of Climbing Poetry. She does multimedia work and is also a spoken word artist. And so what this this artwork really represents is the moment that we're in. So we're at a moment where there's a collective consciousness that mass incarceration is something that we want to work against, something that we want to remedy, but we're also in a hopeful moment where, as Lauren will speak about a little bit later, is that there's a real public support for new alternatives to incarceration. So I want to start by reading the artist statement, which is available at the very bottom of the homepage. And I think this statement really represents where we are right now in the country in this particular moment. As we stand on the crest of history, we look back to see that this wave of oppression has been long rising with the tumultuous spirit of those who drowned in the Atlantic, those who were lynched in the South and in the North, those who were whipped for running, for reading, for dancing, and for speaking, so that the bedrock of an empire could be born debt-free. As the criminalization of Black and Brown communities pushes this legacy of inequality forward, our collective cage multiplies. From this incredible vantage point, we are afforded sight. We can see further than we have ever been able to see before. From this place, more and more people are committing themselves to a system that no longer serves anyone under its rule, even the elite. For a cage is a cage, no matter if it's made of iron or gold. And I think what this poem really does, it's a real reminder as to where we are right now as a nation, and what the possibilities are available in terms of really transforming the criminal justice system. So when you enter the homepage, you'll find the intro paragraph, which really highlights our approach as the opportunity agenda. So we're sure to adopt an intersectional approach in coming up with the solutions and in highlighting the work that our partners are already doing in terms of developing these solutions and advocating for these solutions. And when you come down towards the bottom of the homepage, you find the criminal justice policy solutions lined up in this graphic. And what it starts with is alternatives to incarceration, which is a general theme that you find throughout this report. And then it moves through the criminal justice system as one would encounter it. So from there we go to issues around policing, we go to pretrial services, prosecutorial integrity, indigent defense, sentencing, detention conditions, parole and probation, reintegration, and then toward the bottom you'll find issues deal with people with intersectional identities. So it deals with children, sex, sexuality and gender, criminalization of poverty, criminalization of public health issues, which will deal with drug policy, as well as registries for sex-related conduct, and then criminalization for immigration. And then finally, we also have our public opinion report, which Lauren's going to be speaking about a little bit later. So now I'm going to actually click on the text that says Criminal Justice Policy Solutions. And here it will take you to a separate PDF that highlights these different solutions. That way, when you're thinking about the different ways that the criminal justice system needs to be formed, you have a handy one-page document that you can turn to. And it also has a value statement next to each of these issues that we're currently facing and that we want to address with the criminal justice system. And what's important is that when we're doing our communications, it's always important for us to lead with values. And we had a webinar that dealt with that a little bit earlier. And so we really, at the Opportunity Agenda, we really focus on leading with values because we found through our research that that's how you're really able to connect with persuadable audiences. So in the next couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is walk through one of the individual sections of the report. That way you can actually see some of the resources that are available to you within it. So if you go into Alternatives to Incarceration, you'll see here this paragraph, which is again using the VPSA format. So if you have an interview with a reporter or you're about to draft an op-ed about alternatives to incarceration, you can actually use this as a resource because it leads with the values, then it goes into the problems that we face around alternatives to incarceration, suggests some solutions, and then it has action items. So if you scroll down here, you find a list of solutions and actions. And so I'll just speak about the first solution listed here, which is invest in communities over incarceration. So we chose this as the first solution because we thought it was very important to highlight the need to adopt a new sensibility throughout the criminal justice system. And so what the solution is calling for an executive order to actually prioritize communities over incarceration. And what the goal is that this executive order is very clear and making the intent to actually move away from incarceration, move away through efficiently incarcerating lots of people, and toward actually investing in communities. And so this is a theme that you'll see throughout the report, and we wanted to highlight this to really set the tenor for the way that the criminal justice system can be reformed. So here you'll find 10 solutions listed for each of the different sections. So we also have here, don't fund bad actors. So ensuring that, people, law enforcement agents who are, acting badly or who are being investigated not funded by other parts of the Department of Justice. Removing away from volume-based performance measures is another solution outlined here. So if you click on this, you're able to actually close up the solutions and actions sections. And here you can click on the solutions and actions. So what this is actually best practices from around the country in terms of how people have actually put some of these solutions into practice. And so one of the first solutions and actions we cite, the City of Ithaca's plan, and we actually did work with the Drug Policy Alliance and Cassandra Frederick of developing the communication strategy around this plan. And so this is one example of the ways that you can move away towards incarceration, look to alternatives, and look toward, adopt a public health model when you're dealing with people who are dealing with issues around drugs. And then here we also cite the LEAD program, which is a program that focuses on diversion in Seattle. And then we also have another initiative that deals with policing, and it focuses in different communities. That way, when you're speaking about your different solutions, you're speaking about these issues, you can actually cite to particular places where these solutions are actually being implemented. And so when you scroll down, you find flashcards. And so what these flashcards are, they're actually messaging flashcards that adopt the VPSA format. So here we have one that's focused on reducing incentives to incarceration. We also have one focused on shrinking our bloated criminal justice system. And you can actually click on where it says download PDF and have a PDF that you can turn to. That way, if you're about to go into an interview and you need ideas about how to speak about some of these challenging issues, you have a flashcard that you can turn to and that you can use as a resource for yourself in your communications. So when you scroll to the very bottom of the screen, you'll find additional resources that you can turn to. So we didn't spend a lot of time speaking about the problem with each of these areas because we know that social justice leaders know that there's a problem around mass incarceration. We know that you're familiar with all the issues. However, if you want additional resources, we've listed these resources here and linked to them that we can turn to this as additional source for information. Now, if you look towards the left of each page, you'll also be able to click on the actual section PDF. And so here is the section from the full policy solutions report that deals with alternatives to incarceration. So you can look at this if you want additional information, if you want to find the sources that we pulled in our footnotes, and you can look there for additional information. And these solutions that are listed right over here are actually available in PDF format as well. That way you can also use that as a resource if you're advocating or pushing policymakers to adopt particular approaches, or if you're a policymaker wanting to learn about different approaches that are available, you can look to this PDF, which summarizes the information that's on the website as well. And so towards the left of each section, you're able to download the full PDF, and the full PDF for the solutions document is also available on the home page. So if you click here, you'll find that the full PDF for the document will be available. And so this is the full PDF for the solutions document. And here you have all the resources, and you can look to see what other work groups are doing around these particular issues. And it will be helpful to you as you're learning about issues that you don't necessarily spend most of your time on, but you're interested in learning more about. So I want to leave time for questions, and so I'm going to stop here, but I'm happy to speak with folks after the webinar about the resources that are available on the website and to speak about the website in general. So I'll take some time for questions now. Thanks.
Great, India, thanks. Again, if you have any questions for India, go ahead and enter them into the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. India, the first question, tell us a little bit more about the methodology behind this report.
Sure. So the way that the report was actually created is that we first looked to the resources that were available through our partner reports, and we scanned those resources, and we spoke to several of our partners from different major organizations as well as grassroots organizations to get a sense of what are some of the solutions that they want to uplift, and also to find out where was additional research needed. So I scanned probably about a couple hundred different, policy reports. We scanned a couple hundred, law review articles, criminology articles, as well as sociology articles, to find out what are the best practices, what is actually working, and how can we be comprehensive but still be intersectional, and then uplifting solutions that aren't necessarily being discussed that can actually be helpful. So, for example, in the policing section, one of the solutions we uplift is using insurance as a possible way to hold police accountable. And so what that means is stating that, instead of allowing insurance companies to cover police when there's a civil lawsuit, perhaps we should look to ways to allow insurance companies to claim against police departments that are very problematic or dealing with officers that are repeat actors in terms of criminal police misconduct and police brutality. So, uplifting solutions that aren't necessarily being discussed very widely, but it may be helpful in advocates as they're doing their work.
Great, thanks, India. And that's one of our, if folks have other strong alternatives to incarceration or actions, is there a way that they contribute them to the website's current list?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is actually a living document, and so we'll be updating this continuously, and there's a place on the bottom of the website where you can actually submit additional feedback if you have suggestions, if you think there's certain alternatives that should be uplifted, that other advocates should be made aware of. Absolutely, we're taking feedback and welcome that type of feedback.
Great, thank you. Okay, thanks, India. Next up, we have Lauren Siegel, and she's going to walk us through the public opinion section of the report.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. The title of my report, which you can see on the website, is A New Sensibility, and that's in quotes. And that's a paraphrase from a study by a group of criminologists who conducted a survey of Texas voters, not normally known for their progressive attitudes towards criminal justice issues. And they wrote that the results of their study and others, quote, suggest that a transformation, this is not the slide that should be on, thank you, that a transformation in Americans' sensibility about corrections may be occurring, unquote. I just want to give a quick word about methodology before getting into my findings. This report is based on a review of more than 50 public opinion surveys and polls, most of them conducted between June 2014 and June 2016. And many of them are based on state rather than national samples, which reflects the fact that so many policy reforms have been happening at the state level. Next slide. So the good news is that Americans are becoming less punitive. Political scientist Mark Ramirez, who's at Arizona State University, he's constructed a way to measure what he calls punitive sentiment, which he defines as the aggregate public support for criminal justice policies that punish offenders. So he examines trends in the responses to 4 questions that have been asked repeatedly over time: support for capital punishment, tougher judicial sentencing, increasing the authority of law enforcement, and increasing spending for tougher police enforcement. And by plotting these 4 indicators across time, a pattern emerges, which you can see on this graph. As you can see, punitive sentiment began to increase in the mid-1970s. It reached its apex in the mid-1990s, and it's been on a downward trajectory ever since. And in fact, today, punitive sentiment is about where it was in 1973, before the era of law and order took firm hold. Next slide. Americans believe too many people are in prison today. A nationwide survey commissioned by the ACLU of voters showed that 69% thought it was important for the country to reduce its prison population. And that included 81% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and 54% of Republicans. And of the voters who said reducing the prison population was important, a plurality of 39% said the main reason was because sentences are disproportionately severe, as compared to because the cost of prison is too high, which garnered 29%. And I think that's a very interesting finding, given our concern that the fiscal message would somehow overshadow the moral or value-based message about mass incarceration. The survey also showed that the prospect of a reduced prison population didn't generate fear in the vast majority of respondents. When asked to choose between two statements, one, reducing the prison population will help communities by saving taxpayer dollars that can be reinvested into preventing crime and rehabilitating prisoners, or reducing the prison population will harm communities because criminals who belong behind bars will be let out. The first statement was chosen by 58%, which is what you see on your screen. The second one by only 29%, so that's pretty much a 2-to-1 margin. Very, very hopeful. Next slide. We know that Americans support prevention, rehabilitation, and reintegration. This pie chart is from the survey of Texas voters that I mentioned earlier. Participants were asked to choose what should be the most important priorities for the criminal justice system to focus on when dealing with nonviolent criminals. And as you can see, rehabilitation was chosen by a plurality of 35%. Punishment came in second with 30%. But if you combine rehabilitation and restitution, which are two non-punitive sanctioning goals, you actually have a majority of 65%. And there are a number of other state surveys that I cite in the report that show very similar preferences from states like South Carolina and Louisiana, as well as blue states. So support for prevention, rehabilitation, and reintegration also indicates that redemption or second chance is a core belief. And the ACLU survey actually asked this question explicitly. When asked which statement they agreed with more, people who have committed serious crimes can turn their lives around and move away from a life of crime with the right kind of help, or people who have committed serious crimes are unlikely to change and will almost always be a danger to society, 59% preferred the first statement and 31% preferred the second, again a 2-to-1 margin. Next slide. There's been some movement on racial justice. We know that there is a racial divide when it comes to attitudes towards the criminal justice system in general and the police in particular, but there has been some progress, and as this chart shows, more Americans now believe that the criminal justice system is biased against African Americans than was the case in earlier years. And what you're looking at is I guess it's a green or a chartreuse stripe. You can see that it is growing over time. That indicates an increase of almost 30 points in the percentage of Americans who agree that the criminal justice system is biased against blacks. As one would expect, African Americans are less sanguine about fairness. In 2015, 77% of African Americans believed the system was biased as compared to 44% of whites. Next. On the racial divide and attitudes towards police, which I think many of us are familiar with, the high-profile police killings of unarmed African Americans generated a lot of public opinion research during the last couple of years. And the big takeaway is that although these events did produce some movement among some white Americans towards a greater appreciation of systemic racism, the divide on attitudes towards police remains deep and wide. And there's also a pretty wide gap based on political affiliation, with Democrats moving much further along than Republicans. People of color and whites have very different assessments of whether the police treat everyone equally. And this chart is from a 2015 YouGov Huffington Post survey. And you can see that only 6% of black people agree that police treat blacks fairly, as compared to 47% of whites, with Hispanics falling somewhere in between at about 20%. There are also very big partisan differences. Next. Now I wanted to go into some of the challenges that face us as we try to turn around the huge ship of mass incarceration. First on the list is fear. In spite of the widely reported drop in the crime rate year after year, according to Gallup's annual crime poll, a majority of Americans think there is more crime in the U.S. than there was a year ago. Now, Gallup suggests that the 7-point increase from 2014 to 2015 may be a function of people reacting to news reports of increased violent crime in many major U.S. cities. Crime may be down, but the homicide spike in Chicago, for example, has gotten a lot of media attention. And the mass shootings during this period also seem to occur pretty regularly. So that could be contributing to people's fear. The next challenge we face, of course, is racialization of crime, and the consensus among scholars is that crime is racialized in the U.S. In a test of the so-called racial threat theory, meaning the extent to which whites support punitive criminal justice policies because they view blacks as a criminal threat, a group of criminologists at Florida State University found that fear of victimization was higher among respondents who reported that the number of black people living in their neighborhood had increased in the past 5 years. So it's this change and this increase that people perceive as frightening. Another challenge is the intersection of crime and immigration. Current immigration enforcement, excuse me, with its emphasis on the identification, arrest, detention, and deportation of criminal aliens by local law enforcement, has blurred the line between immigration control and criminal justice. And there's evidence that so-called crimmigration has affected Americans' assessment of Latino threat and has increased their support for aggressive policing and profiling. Violent versus nonviolent, those labels have created a really unhelpful dichotomy that reduces support for sentencing reform. Basically, the violent label further stigmatizes an already stigmatized population. The only research we found probing this issue was by the ACLU, and they found that violent is a buzzword that pushes voters away from supporting reforms. But when the researchers tested support for reduced sentences for specific crimes, a potentially important finding did emerge. And as this chart shows, when you add information that someone convicted of armed assault committed the crime, quote, 15 years ago and had a clean record in prison, that significantly increases support for a reduced sentence for that individual. If you look at the chart, armed assault alone, only 18% think that the sentence should be reduced. But when you add that additional individualized information, that goes up to 57%. And finally, the final challenge is systemic versus individual causes. There's not actually a lot of recent data on what Americans currently think about the root causes of crime. The question was most recently asked in an explicit way in 2006 in a survey by the National Center for State Courts. And at that time, when presented with a list of 5 possible main causes of crime, Americans favored 2 individual causes, either drugs at 33%, or the breakdown of the family at 26%. Poverty was not included in the list. The closest was unemployment, which was chosen by only 10%. So clearly, as of 10 years ago, the public overall did not understand the intersection of crime, poverty, racism, hopelessness, etc. Next. Now we get to the recommendations, and there are a series of 8 of them. So the first set of recommendations has to do with reinforcing and expanding support for real reform. Build on the belief that people who have committed serious crimes can turn their lives around and move away from a life of crime with the right kind of help. And by that I mean publicize studies and specific examples of successful reentry and reintegration. But be careful when telling stories of individuals who've come out of prison and given back, not to give the impression that this is unique or even unusual. Emphasize that many thousands of formerly incarcerated people who've been offered educational and employment opportunities have been successful, and showcase successful government-funded reentry roundtables and programs, especially those that have been shown to reduce recidivism. Second, emphasize prevention, but define it holistically. Americans support the idea of prevention, but many have a narrow view of what it means. It's not just evening basketball for, quote, inner city youth. Healthy communities are safe communities, and healthy communities are communities that have good schools, good jobs, good housing, etc. And that's what effective crime prevention entails. So keep hammering on the link between crime, hopelessness, and lack of opportunity. A majority of Americans believe that it is important for the country to reduce its prison population, and a plurality say the main reason is because sentences are disproportionately severe. And this message should be front and center and repeated over and over again until it becomes widely accepted. Once the public understands that reducing the length of sentences is critical to ending mass incarceration and not compromising public safety, then support for specific sentencing reforms will be easier to build and sustain. 4, educate around the fact that shorter sentences are consistent with public safety. Show through existing credible studies that long sentences do not improve public safety. The same outcomes can be realized with shorter sentences. And my last slide. Keep reminding audiences that the criminal justice system is discriminatory at every stage, from policing through sentencing and the death penalty. Emphasize the roles of unconscious or implicit bias and structural racism in producing very disparate outcomes for white people and people of color. And also we found in research that the term discriminatory is more resonant than disparate. Change the language. Take care not to use terms like offender, ex-offender, ex-convict, inmate, and refrain from describing crimes as nonviolent whenever possible. The movement prefers phrases like incarcerated person, formerly incarcerated person, and returning citizen. 7, emphasize that mass incarceration is a serious American problem that affects the country as a whole, and invoke the values of fairness, equal treatment, second chance, and community. And finally, conduct more public opinion research. And there are a couple of areas that especially I think would be fruitful areas to do more research on. One is how to talk about people convicted of serious offenses. The ACLU research cited in this report offers some hints at what might work, but more research would be great. Another area is how to disentangle criminal justice and immigration reform. Another would be, and I don't think there's been much research on this, support for criminal records reform, which is a very big issue in the movement today. So that concludes. Sorry if I've gone a little over. It's a big report. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Again, if you have any questions for Lauren, please go ahead and post those to the question function in your GoToWebinar panel. We did get one question about salience, Lauren. Do Americans care about criminal justice reform? Do they think it's important?
Yes, well, there was actually a poll done in January of 2016 that asked people what their priorities for President Obama and Congress were for the year coming. And it listed a series of options, and reforming the criminal justice system was considered a top priority by 44% of respondents, and an important but lower priority by 39%, which adds up to 83% of the American public that thinks that criminal justice reform is important. And just for comparison's sake, that's a greater number of people than, at least at that time in January 2016, thought it was a higher priority than global trade issues. And again, we see a racial divide on these issues, with 73% of blacks thinking it's very important, 48% of Hispanics, and 39% of white people. So the answer is yes, it has traction when it's offered. I suspect that if it was an open-ended question that did not provide a list of choices, that reforming criminal justice might not appear. We'd have to try that out. I'm not sure.
Great, thanks, Lauren. We have another question about alternatives to using that violent and nonviolent language. What resonates with public opinion as far as other language?
You know, I really think that this question, it gets to sort of the crux of what we have to deal with right now. You know, we've been so successful at peeling off the nonviolent drug offenders, but in the process have, as I mentioned before, created this really not constructive dichotomy. And even the public opinion research that's done on sentencing is framed in terms of nonviolent offenders. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on this. I think the number one thing is to do no harm, and that means to refrain from using that kind of language as much as possible. To emphasize the fact that all sentences, or most sentences in this country, are too long. reminding people that people can change. There's a lot of support in this country for ending mandatory minimum sentences, which are largely responsible for the horrendously long sentences that a lot of folks get. So I think that pushing for more discretion in sending, the return of parole, and that sort of thing, all of those things, all of those messages will be very important in creating the belief or building the belief that shorter sentences can be just as good at protecting public safety as longer ones, and can even be better.
Great. Lauren, thank you so much. Our final speaker today is Julie Fisher-Rao, and she's going to talk about how to apply these findings to your communications.
Great, thank you. So Lauren just spoke a little bit about some of the things that we can say to try to move these issues forward in the public mind. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that. So next slide, please. So the first thing, in seeing how many different aspects of the criminal justice system have been pushed to the forefront in both the media and popular culture, and in other ways that have really opened up some conversations. First thing is to decide where and how and why you want to engage. So depending on what your goals are for your policy moves or what you want in your community, it's important to take a look at the opportunities that come through and really try to decide, where am I going to have the most impact? Where can I spotlight the solutions I want? Where can I audiences who are most likely to move my issues forward? And this is important just because so many of us have limited time and limited resources, and we may see a headline and think, oh, I should really leverage that headline. But we really need to do the work to think, is this a better headline for maybe one of my partners to engage in and leverage? Is this are there better ways, or is there a better time? Maybe I can use this to leverage this idea in an op-ed maybe a week later, rather than trying to jump into the fray. Or if I'm going to jump into the fray, who do I want to speak to and what do I hope to accomplish by doing that? So it's basically communication strategy 101, but it's a good idea to always back up and have this in mind. Why am I doing this, and what is the best way for me to do it? Next slide, please. The second important piece of this is to really consider your audience. Lauren talked about a lot of the differences that are occurring among racial audiences, among partisan audiences. There are gender differences. There are a number of different ways that affect the way that we think about things, the way that our identities affect the way that we process information and decide where we come down on it. So the more that we know what our audiences are thinking, the more we decide which audiences are most open to our arguments, the more effective we can be. Sometimes we use this 1 through 5 scale to try to help people think through who their audiences are. 1 would be the folks who are right there with us, the base, the folks who are willing to pick up a sign and go and march, to make the phone call when needed. It's important in our strategy to keep these folks motivated and engaged and interested and hopeful, while also considering the rest of these audiences. The 2s through the 4s are the persuadables, the folks who might be able to come along with the right message, with the right spokesperson, with the right ask. And this is a really core part of any strategy, is getting these folks to come along with us, to consider what is really going to motivate them, what is going to make them think differently, what is going to have them thinking about our issue and whether they want to act. Maybe they care a little bit, but they care about other issues more. Getting them activated is going to be a big part of then moving them to realize our policy goals. And then finally, the 5s are the folks who are our opposition, folks who are not probably ever going to agree with us on these issues. And our attention to them should be not so much in arguing with them or pointing out how they're wrong, because there's not much that we can do about that, but rather to really think about how we can keep them from affecting the rest of our audiences. Next slide, please. So the other thing to remember is the leaders who have been affected by the system are some of our best spokespeople within the system or in talking about the system. So this really means not making room at the table for folks who have been in part of the system, but really recognizing their leadership and how they can be helpful in being spokespeople for it, and really in how they can be leaders in our communications efforts. It's also important to remember to prep all spokespeople for the potential consequences of sharing their personal stories. And that means both legally and personally. Sometimes it can take a lot out of people to tell their story, and they might not realize that right away. So really be working with spokespeople to make sure that they understand the implications and that they are able to tell their story the most effective way that is also protective of them as people, because that's what matters the most really, is how we are all working with each other as people. Next slide, please. The fourth thing to remember is this idea of telling a proactive story instead of a reactive story. So to not repeat the myths and the lies that we hear out there. There are so many, obviously, but it's important to not repeat them, because that just makes them stronger in people's heads. And there's a lot of research that shows this. Our brains tend to remember things that are stated as facts. So even if you state something as a myth and then say, oh, actually, here's the fact that debunks that, there's a pretty good likelihood that people are going to remember the myth. And we don't want to do that. Instead, we want to tell what the real story is. So be affirmative. You can counter lies and misinformation, but counter it with the truth. Counter it with what's really going on out there. Next slide, please. And finally, and India talked about this, the structure to build a message. So next slide also. The first is to lead with values. We call this VPSA, Value, Problem, Solution, Action, to build a message. The most important is to really start with this idea of an inspirational and forward-thinking idea, something that will open up space in people's brains to be hopeful and inspirational, to think about things in a different way. People have their minds kind of set and made up a little bit around a lot of issues that we talk about. If you can reframe it in a values way, this is about the kind of country we want to be. This is about our values of equal opportunity, and we need to make sure that we're providing that for everybody. And second then, next slide please, is to then bring forward the problem and to frame it as a threat to the vision and the values. Frame it as something we need to rescue those values from this problem that is emerging, that is showing how we are not living up to our ideals as Americans, or as in our state or in our community. Next is the solution. That keeps audiences hopeful and restores values. That makes sure that people don't get tired of hearing things, hearing about all the problems in the world, and actually believe there are solutions. That's what this report is all about, and why it's so why it's going to be so useful, I hope, to all of you, is because it really does outline all the solutions that we have been talking about. Next, please. And the action is finally move your audience to action. Give them something to do. Give them a reason to become part of your movement, and that can be a really important piece of your entire strategy. Obviously, is we're not talking to people just to educate them or just to give them more information. We actually want to move them to action so they come along and actually make a difference in our criminal justice system. Next. Oh, that's the final slide, actually. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. We also have time for questions for other panelists as well.
Great, thanks, Julie. Once again, if you have any final questions either for Julie or for India or Lauren, go ahead and enter those into your GoToWebinar panel. We do have a question. I think this question is probably for Lauren, about how do we talk, maybe for Lauren and or Julie, how do we talk about this idea around criminal aliens, quote unquote. We have a lot of immigrants that are caught up in a discriminatory criminal justice system. How can we talk about that more effectively?
Julie, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I mean, I think this goes back to Lauren's suggestion of talking about how the system is discriminatory. Most of our audiences, even those 2s, 3s, and a lot of the 4s, do not realize how immigrants are caught up in the system, don't realize how there are separate justice systems for immigrants than there are for native-born folks. So being clear about that and just taking a little bit of time to talk about what the differences are and why the system is so unfair and what the solutions are can move people away from, if you're not careful in doing that first, the people's first question will be, well, what did they do and why are they here, and all of these things. So moving it away from individual circumstances and talking about the unfairness of the system.
Great. Lauren, we've gotten a couple questions around how people can access your public opinion report. Can you just go over that one more time, that it is actually available on that Transforming the System website?
Yes, I invite you all to read the report on the Transforming the System website. It's there. Just click on it and you'll get to it. It's about, I think, 36 pages long. Lots of nice graphs and charts. And a long list of citations at the back of all the studies that were included.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's all the questions we received today, so we can go ahead and wrap up a little bit early. I want to thank India, Lauren, and Julie again for sharing their knowledge and this interesting report with us. And thank you to all the Opportunity Agenda staff and consultants who made today's webinar a success. Particularly, I want to mention Elizabeth Johnson, Jamila Brown, Will Coley, Ross Mudrick, and Juhutu Kral. If you have any questions about today's material, please feel free to reach out to us. We're going to be sending a link with a recording of the webinar and other materials as a follow-up. You can share that with any colleagues who couldn't make it today. And again, as a reminder, as you do close out of GoToWebinar, you're going to have a short evaluation that pops up. Please do take the time to fill that out. We really appreciate all your feedback. Thank you again so much for joining, and please have a great day.